Hello, welcome to the ITF screens. ITF 2020. This is our literature event online, and this is the last session. In the autumn, we want to hold our actual festival. We will be on the streets in Istanbul. We are very excited to see you there. And this event, our guest is David Nicholls with his new book, Sweet Sorrow, and he will have a chat with Rosie Goldsmith. I should read Rosie's biography, but I am such a big fan of her. Everything she did, I say I want to do that too. Want to be like her, and I really applaud you. And you're my great inspiration. She got many awards in Britain. She's a journalist, and for 20 years, she also acted as a moderator and introduced in cultural and art programs. And she also encouraged people to read more. She also founded a network. She's very active on social media, on Facebook, on Twitter. You can follow her. And she's also interested in Turkish literature. She had interviews with many authors. She also got many literature awards. Either she was also in the jury or she was heading the jury. And she wants to come to Turkey, right, Rosie?
Always, always. You've invited me so many times, Nermin, and I haven't been for a while, but I need to come again.
Evet Rosie, mikrofonu sana bırakıyorum.
Yes, Rosie. I leave the floor to you. I will hide my video now and we'll talk to you later. And now we'll listen to David and Rosie.
Wonderful. Thank you, Nermin, so much. And also for embarrassing me so much as well. But it's lovely, you know, that I live for literature in the same way that you do as well. And it is a great, great pleasure for me to introduce, and he knows this is the truth, one of my favorite authors, and for the closing event of the Istanbul International Literature Festival, and a very, very special occasion, because this is the launch of David Nicholls' novel, Sweet Sorrow, in Turkish today. Welcome, David. We're not in the same room, on the same stage, in the same city, but I think you'd like to be in Istanbul too, wouldn't you?
I'd love to, yeah. I came to Istanbul 6 years ago, just for 3 or 4 days, and stayed in Karakoy with my family, and sailed on the Bosphorus and had amazing food, and I really loved the city. It was a beautiful, fantastic place, fascinating.
Absolutely. Well, we both long to return, I must say. Now, we've actually also learned the Turkish translation of Sweet Sorrow. I've learned it. Have you learned it, David?
I haven't, I'm afraid. You know, on my computer, I've written the words Teşekkür ederim, which I think is thank you. So that's all I've managed to learn.
Thank you.
Ederim, but I don't know the title, I'm afraid. No.
Well, the title is Tatlı Hüzün and Sweet Sorrow in Turkish, and it's been translated by Arzu Altanit, and that's what we're launching tonight. And we're also grateful while we're thinking about it, because we love to name the translators always, for our interpreter tonight, Mine, because without Mine, we wouldn't be able to do this. Now, David, we've got a lot to get through. We want to talk about Sweet Sorrow. We want to talk about your other novels, because this is about all of you, for everybody out there. So welcome everyone to this. And we'll get on to talking a little bit about your screenwriting, and maybe a few kind of lockdown questions at the end, because we are living in a very strange, surreal, unusual, hopefully unrepeatable time. I'm not going to give you a very long Wikipedia style introduction to David Nicholls, because you can read it online, you can read it on the website also of the ITEF. But I'm going to just quickly remind you of the novels that David has written. Now, the very first novel was Starter for 10, and that was in 2003. And then The Understudy, and then One Day, which was 10 years ago, just over 10 years ago. And that novel is the one, they say, your breakout novel, the phenomenal novel that sold millions, as has Sweet Sorrow, which is your fifth novel. So in between One Day and Sweet Sorrow, we have Us, which I absolutely love, because it is the story of a European grand tour which is something we can only dream of at the moment,
Yes.
traveling through Europe. But but anyway, all these novels, I've read every single one of them, and I've had the great pleasure of interviewing David before. Now we're going to start off talking about Sweet Sorrow. And this is about, I think all your novels are about love. And this is about first love. Tell us about Charlie. Charlie Lewis is your protagonist. He's 16 years old. It's the summer of love for him, 1997. Describe Charlie to us and what happens in that summer.
Charlie is a kind of lost boy. You know, he's failed all his exams. His friends are going to college or they're starting jobs, and he doesn't really know what he's doing with his life. His family has just exploded. His parents have broken up. And the summer, the long, long, long summer of 1997 is stretching ahead of him, and he doesn't really know what's going to happen. He's full of worry. He's a little lonely. He doesn't really know who he is. He's a kind of blank canvas. And one day, by chance, he meets a girl called Fran, and he likes her and he wants to see her again. But the only way he can see her is to spend the summer with her putting on a play, a Shakespeare play. And for Charlie, this is a horrific idea. He hates Shakespeare, he hates theatre, it's all pretentious. He doesn't really understand literature or books. He's sort of thrown by this, the horror of standing up and speaking Shakespeare. But if he wants to see Fran, he has to do it. And so he joins a theatre company. And Sweet Sorrow is the story of how that summer changes his life. It's a very classic coming of age love story told over the course of one summer. It's also a book about memory. Charlie is remembering this. So the narrator is 38-year-old Charlie looking back at his younger self with a mixture of embarrassment, regret, but also some nostalgia too.
The title Sweet Sorrow is taken from Romeo and Juliet, and the novel is based partly on that story of young love, Romeo and Juliet. And the phrase is actually from the balcony scene, isn't it? When Juliet is on the balcony, she's saying goodbye to Romeo. And Act 2, Scene 2. Can you remember the lines?
Yeah, the whole line is, parting is such sweet sorrow that I would say goodnight until 'tis morrow. And I loved the idea. The novel, when I was writing it, was called Summer. And then it was called September, because it was about that sense of summer coming to an end. It was about the sadness of a lost summer, lost youth. And then I read the play, Romeo and Juliet, and came across this famous line, sweet sorrow. And it seemed to sum up the mood of the book and also the experience of first love. You know, that there is the idea in Shakespeare's line that saying goodbye has a kind of joy in it, that pleasure and sadness are kind of linked together, particularly at that age, particularly for young lovers. I thought was a really amazing idea, a wonderful contradiction. And it seemed also to sum up the mood of the book, which is a combination of romantic comedy, you know, first love, falling in love, the mistakes you make, but also a sort of sadder book about how confusing adolescence can be, how difficult those times, that time of our life can be, how big the emotions are. So it seemed to be the perfect title, much better title than Summer.
Well, and I do love I always love the way that you integrate and weave literary references into all your novels. I mean, I know that you studied English as well.
Yeah.
I mean, everything that you've ever done comes also into all your novels: comedy, acting, working in theatre, and reading. You're obviously a very great reader as well. And the drama of Shakespeare is so perfect for this. It's not just the fun, if you like, of the amateur dramatics, which we all, I don't know what it's like in Turkey, but we all have to go through doing dram at school or at university, and it's kind of horrific. But
everyone does it.
But everyone does. I won't ask you which roles you play, or which roles did you play at school?
I was in Midsummer Night's Dream a lot. I was in a Midsummer Night's Dream maybe 5 or 6 times. I played Puck, I played Lysander, I played Demetrius, I played Theseus. I was very bad always in all of those roles. But I was not a very good actor, but I was a very passionate actor. And I have always loved books and reading and plays and films and all of those things. But I think there's something about the books you read at 15, 16, 17. It's almost as if your nerve endings are heightened, are turned up, and they stayed with me all my life, really. So I wanted to write about that time of life when you're particularly receptive to literature, to books, to plays, to all of those words and music. Charlie is skeptical. You know, when I was that age, I loved being in plays. I loved reading. It's all I did, really. But Charlie doesn't quite understand it at the beginning of the book. As the book goes on, he sort of changes his mind and learns not to be scared of culture, of literature.
But that's also fascinating as well, because very cleverly, yet again, I think with all your novels, you demonstrate the transformative power of art and literature in our lives. I mean, everybody changes a little bit because of their contact with the arts. I love that about Charlie as well. I mean, he would never ever have done this play Romeo and Juliet if it weren't for Fran.
For Fran, yeah. I mean, in the novel, he finds that being involved in this play, listening to this language all day, every day, even though he doesn't always understand it, it has an effect on the way he thinks and feels, and he learns things from the play, even though it feels like a foreign language to him. And even in the play, you know, Romeo and Juliet are changed by each other. When Romeo and Juliet in the play meet for the first time, they start speaking in poetry. Up until then, they've been speaking prose. They've been speaking in a very down-to-earth way. When they meet, they start to rhyme. You know, they speak in the form of a sonnet, a 14-line poem with a couplet at the end, with a rhyming pair at the end. So I love this idea that falling in love or meeting people, those influences change not just the external part of your life, but the way you think and feel.
It is quite wonderful how you remember first love. And I wonder, I mean, do you write journals or diaries? Did you write? It's a gift, David, always. I mean, as I say, I think you write about love in all your novels, but to be able to recall that feeling. And there is a line again from Romeo and Juliet where Juliet says, I wrote it down, a state of being in love, for in a minute there are many days.
Yes.
That's what you feel.
I don't have, I mean, I certainly never wrote a diary. It was a particularly kind of tempestuous time, but also a very boring time. You know, the love stories that I tell in the books are way, way, way more eventful and dramatic than anything in real life. And the summer of my 16th year, which wasn't 1997, it was much, much earlier, was really boring. Nothing happened. I worked in a factory for the whole summer. But I do have a recall, I suppose, for the awkwardness of that age, for the difficulty of self-expression, for the problem of deciding who you are and how you want to present yourself, for the comedy of it, and also for the worry and the loneliness of it. I wanted this book to be a very classic first love story, but to be very tough and realistic about how difficult that age can be as well. And I even though the book isn't particularly autobiographical, I do have a very strong kind of emotional memory, I suppose. I don't remember names or faces or conversations, but I remember what it feels like.
And you're very clear in all your novels that these are not autobiographical novels, but what you are capturing each time is that feeling of being a particular age. And I think you've spoken about that before. And you spoke about also the difficulties that Charlie has just now. And Charlie is going through a difficult time, and his father is depressed and an alcoholic. And you address these issues of how a young person confronts mental illness at age as well. And I think, that is something which is very difficult for a lot of people to talk about. And I thought that was so perceptively described as well. Tell us a little bit about why you wanted to include that in the
I think I wanted to, a lot of people's, we're much better now, I think, men in particular, in acknowledging and talking about these things. But certainly when I was a kid, no one would have even dreamed of saying that they were depressed. And I wanted to write a whole novel in which, until the very end, no one dares to use the word. You know, they talk about someone being a little bit down, a little bit sad, but no one dares to use a clinical word, a medical word. And I think I wanted also to write about the challenges of being a carer when at that age, when, you know, there's so much happening. You want to spend all your time with your friends, you want to meet people, you want life to change, and yet at the same time you have to deal with the often frustrating, boring, frightening business of caring for someone who isn't able to look after themselves. More and more in the books I've written about family. When I started writing fiction, they were very straightforward romantic comedies. You know, they were about dating and meeting people and the difficulties of that. And I love that material. But as I've got older, that has become further and further away from my experience. And now I'm much more interested in loneliness, the sadness, that the difficulties that exist within families, the lack of communication, all of those things that started to creep into the books as I've got older.
Well, which is, I should think, perfectly natural in that sense
Yeah.
too, as each book is the same. And of course, then they're definitely not. I mean, you mentioned comedy as well, and you're always very self-deprecating about this, but you have an incredible gift for comedy. I mean, this book, more than any other, I mean, I laughed a lot at Us. You know, Us spoke very much to me as somebody who travels a lot. But this book, I just could not stop laughing. And, you know, it is so funny. I
hope so.
I mean, this comes naturally to you, isn't it? I mean, it's not something that you find difficult, is it? To be, I know you don't.
In real life, I do. You know, in my family, if I start to tell a joke, you can feel the tension in the room. One thinks, oh my God, he's going to try and be funny. But I like the way...
Never be funny, you know, Dad's... but you can.
I like the way on the page that a very precise order of words or a very precise choice of words can make an observation funny. And as a kid growing up, I loved comedy. I loved comic novels. I loved Monty Python and television comedy and comedy films, Billy Wilder, Golden Age American comedies, kind of wild, crazy Steve Martin comedies. I just loved it all. And it seemed to me that what a lot of them had in common was precision, just very precise use of rhythm, words, language, and that's what I try and do in the novels.
Good comic timing. Well, look, let's possibly just remind people, we're not going to use this as a spoiler, but of course Romeo and Juliet is a story of doomed lovers.
Yes.
So on that note, we'll move on. Now, as we said, 10 years ago, you wrote One Day, and that was a little bit over 10 years in English. Of course, the translation is about a year later. Let's go back to One Day, because some people see One Day and Us and Sweet Sorrow as a kind of trilogy almost.
Yeah.
Do you see them like that? Did you ever intend to write One Day, Us and Sweet Sorrow as a trilogy?
No, I love the idea of writing linked novels because it gives you a framework to work in. But for me, it's only now looking back that I can see that they're all about, they will have a central relationship, a male-female relationship. They all have a 20 to 25 year flashback, you know, that it's often about getting old. Often the theme is, how did I get here from there? What are the events that changed me, and in what ways did I stay the same? So I think maybe that's a preoccupation about how aging changes us. And they cover a kind of a lifespan, I suppose. Not an entire lifespan, but Charlie is 16 and Douglas in Us is 56 at the end of the novel. And I was curious as to, you know, how relationships change as we age. What remains the same, and what can we alter? I think they're all about people trying to be good and making mistakes. I think often father-son relationships come into them. You know, Dexter in One Day has a a difficult relationship with his father, and Us is all about a father and son, and Charlie and his dad in Sweet Sorrow, that's a big theme. But they're all love stories. They're all comedies with an element of sadness. They're all to some degree about fate. So yeah, they do have themes, but it's never conscious. You write about what preoccupies you and what excites you as a subject, and inevitably certain themes come up again and again.
Are you also, I mean, it's obvious in each book, you're also exploring issues, ideas that are interesting for you. You have to live with these books for several years while you're writing them, so you've got to be really interested in them and interested in the people. So what is it like to live with these characters for such a long time? And do you change as a result?
I don't know if I change, but the novels definitely come from a particular period in my life. If I hadn't written One Day and you gave me the story of One Day and you said, can you go and write this novel? I would have notes, you know, I would change things. I wouldn't be able to write it now. I definitely wouldn't be able to write it now. There are lots of things that I would think, I'm not sure if that's right. I think maybe that's a bit corny, that's a bit predictable. I don't know if I like that character. But when I was 39, it's the only book I could write. And if you'd given my 39-year-old self Us, the novel about marriage and about being a dad, I wouldn't have had a clue, you know. So they're not necessarily autobiographical, but they all spring up out of a particular set of circumstances and a particular stage of life. With One Day, it was a kind of farewell to my 20s and 30s, where friendship and going out and having fun and working out your profession, all of those things were what I was obsessed with. At 50, I couldn't write that. And so it's a kind of weird fictional diary, a kind of parallel growing old, I suppose. Though I don't want to write characters who are always the same age as me. That in a way is why I went back to 16, because I've never written about first love.
So do you ever read your books again?
No.
Oh gosh, that was a powerful no.
No, that's not true. I do. I haven't read One Day for a long time, but I've just worked on a TV adaptation of Us, and I had to read that again to write the scripts. And that's very strange. You know, you don't remember writing it. A lot of passages you think, wow, this is quite good. Who did this? And similarly, sometimes you think, this is terrible. I wish I could change this. And when you write a script, you can. So it is a bit like going through an old photo album, which isn't to say they're about me, but they just very much spring from a time of life. And I'm critical of them. But I'm not embarrassed. I'm proud of all of them, especially these last three, which are the ones I really love. But I wouldn't. It's slightly excruciating.
Like first love, maybe. The narrative devices that you use in each novel, I mean, they're wonderfully plotted, and they're perfectly worked out. And I know that this is something that you've spoken about before, but I think it's a really interesting aspect of what you do, is that there is always a very clear structure.
Yeah.
And it comes from, I imagine, from theatre, from acting, from being with actors all the time, from your dialogue is exceptionally good. And I'd love you to talk us through that a little bit, these narrative devices that you use, which, say, in One Day, you've got the 20 years, same day, over 20 years, the 15th of July. And then with Sweet Sorrow, you've got the 3 months of a summer, 1997. And so on. So maybe just talk us through those influences on your fiction.
Yes, I mean, the structure has to come from the story, but I do think in terms of architecture, it's almost like writing a book is a series of boxes, and you have to fill in each of the boxes with certain actions, certain dialogue, certain things to move the story forwards. But beyond that, they have another structure. You know, One Day is 21 blocks of action, and I knew that it would go right back to the beginning. Even before I started writing, I knew that it would kind of form a loop, and that you would answer, there'd be a question in chapter 1 that would be answered in chapter 21. So that was always in my head. Us, because it was about a journey, I knew that it would be very fast. It would be leaping all over the place because it was about travel in time and space. So that has 180 very, very short chapters. Some are longer, some are shorter, but they leap around all over the place. And Sweet Sorrow, it was almost like to begin with, you're in the past and it's told from the present, and that as the novel goes on, the present would take over from the past until you find out where you end up. So I could draw you a diagram of each of the novels, and the diagram I have in my head before I start, which doesn't mean that things don't change, but I do need to know what the structure and point of view is going to be before I start writing. I mean, I don't want to be too boring or technical, but point of view is absolutely crucial. Whether you're in the character's head exclusively so that you only see and say what the character does, or whether you're looking over the world like in One Day, where you are jumping around from different viewpoints. I have to know that before I start writing as well.
I mean, it is a very distinct feature of how you write. Not only are your novels very literary, they are very, very easy to see immediately as TV or a film. And you have adapted, is it 2 of your novels as films? So that
scripts of all 5, but,
yes.
but 3 have been made.
3 have been. You've got Us is sitting there waiting in lockdown.
Yeah.
Have you completed Us? It's a TV series, I think.
Us is finished, except that we, and it's really good. I really love it. But we were just about to broadcast it, and then London locked down, and we weren't able to do the sound recording and the music. So once we have the sound, we have the music, then that'll be on television. And that's 4 hours, 1 hours for the BBC. But it's very different from the book because the book is always in the character's head. So he's observing things, he's making comparisons, he's making jokes, that when you write the script, you just have to scribble out because they're internal. Scripts are all about external action, what characters say and do. But novels, the great luxury of a novel is you can really go into a character's mind. And even if they're not self-aware, you can explore why they're doing what they're doing.
So Starter for 10 is a film.
Yeah.
The first film, and then One Day, also a wonderful film with Anne Hathaway and Jim Sturgis.
That's right.
And you wrote that one as well.
Yeah.
And I mean, tell me what it's like writing the script for your own book, though. I mean, you've told us a little bit about Us, but does it mean that, I mean, would you rather write a script than write a novel?
No, certainly not of my own book. It's much, much easier to adapt someone else's book than your own book. Because when
why do you do it then?
Because it's very hard to see someone else do it. It's very painful. And because I was also a screenwriter before I was a novelist, so I'm not naive about the necessity of cutting, of changing, of taking out things that are only funny because you know what the character's thinking. If you don't know what the character's thinking, it won't be funny. So many times. And that is something that I've learned through experience, through shooting big, long scenes that when you watch them objectively from an outsider's point of view, have no comedy in them whatsoever. Often reading a novel, you will laugh at a simile or a metaphor or an observation. There's no role for that in a screenplay. You just have to cut them all. So it's very, very painful. At the same time, they come from somewhere inside. So the idea of handing it over to someone who may be not as experienced as the screenwriter and saying, you know, carve this to pieces is tough too. But I don't enjoy it as much as I enjoy adapting other people's work. That is much more, it's possible to be much more objective, much less emotional.
Before I ask you about the other adaptations you've done, I do want to ask you whether you will ever, on that, from what you've just been saying, whether you would ever write the screenplay or script for Sweet Sorrow.
I may, it's sort of under discussion. It's under discussion. But it's a tricky one because, again, Charlie, if you go through the novel and you underline what Charlie says, he doesn't say very much. And a screenplay is what people say and do. And Charlie is often quite passive. You know, he's watching and he's thinking and he's not able to express himself. So how do you put the inability to speak onto the screen without just creating a blank? That's the big challenge. So who knows?
With great actors, and you've actually worked with some very, very great actors.
Yeah.
I'm thinking of Benedict Cumberbatch, for instance, and as some people may know, you won a BAFTA. You did an extraordinary adaptation of Edward St Auburn's Patrick Melrose novels. Now, this was last year, 2018, when 2018, I think, when Patrick Melrose came out, and it's quite a horrific story, and surprisingly horrific for you.
Yeah.
And I wonder whether that's fair enough. I mean, just very quickly, so people know, the Patrick Melrose stories are about a man played by Benedict Cumberbatch who is a drug addict and was abused as a child. And you spent 5 years, I recall, writing these adaptations. There's no comedy in this. There's no very. How did you cope with this?
There is a kind of dark wit, I suppose. But I read them. I used to work in a bookshop in 1992, and I read the first Patrick Melrose book, and I was amazed and shocked by it. I thought it was wonderful. And there were 5 of the novels, and I read them when they came out, and I really loved them. But I did what every working screenwriter does. I auditioned. You know, I met the producers and I gave my speech, and then I met Edward St Aubyn, the author, and I gave my speech, and I said what I loved and what I would change and why, and I got the job. So it's like auditioning for a role. But there's often a difference between what you read and what you can write. You know, those books, those wonderful books are based in Edward's particular experiences. And I can approach them almost like a carpenter, you know, like a technician, and cut off a bit here and move it there and nail this speech to this scene. So there is a technical element to screenwriting that I find really interesting, but doesn't have to come from inside in the way that fiction, I think, does have to.
So it doesn't, I mean, the impact on us as viewers is really quite, I mean, I could never take more than 1 episode, and I could never binge watch Patrick Melrose, which I know that everybody seems to be doing at the moment with everything, but because it was so disturbing and so upsetting. Whereas you can distance yourself a little bit, can you, because of the technique of writing?
Yes, but I wouldn't have done it if I thought it was just, you know, bleak and upsetting. I also, for me, what I loved about the novels were they were about recovery. They weren't just about suffering. They were about getting better. They were about redemption and forgiveness. And there was a kind of a dark, concealed optimism to them that I found very moving. But like I said, you know, I'd love to write a horror story or a science fiction film or a children's story on screen. I couldn't necessarily do it on the page.
Or a comedy, straight comedy.
A straight comedy with a happy ending.
Just, you mentioned some of your, well, we were just going to talk a little bit about some of your other adaptations and go back to the novels. I mean, you obviously love Thomas Hardy and Charles Dickens very much. And you've done some wonderful adaptations, Great Expectations, Tess of the D'Urbervilles. And of course, Tess of the D'Urbervilles is a little bit the one-day story, isn't it? I mean, they're all somehow linked, aren't they?
Yeah. You know, at the age when Charlie appears in Romeo and Juliet and Sweet Sorrow, I was doing nothing except reading. You know, I was reading Charles Dickens and John Irving and everything by Thomas Hardy and Scott Fitzgerald and J.D. Salinger and all of these writers who have sort of formed my own imagination as a writer and writers who I aspire to. But they all feed into the books in different ways. You know, it's all a kind of fuel. Great Expectations is all over Starter for 10. And Tess, I remember very vividly sitting in a field like Charlie in Sweet Sorrow and reading Tess of the D'Urbervilles and reading a passage where Tess looks into the future and imagines a particular day in the calendar when something might happen in the future the idea that you pass through this particular day every year without knowing. And at 16, I remembered that. Many years later, I was writing the scripts of the book and I remembered it again. And that's where the idea for one day came from. So my advice to writers is always just read, read, read, read, read. It's not theft, it's inspiration. And everything I've ever written, I could draw you up a list of books and films and songs that have provided the foundations for that story, hopefully for an original story, but nevertheless drawn from all the amazing books and films and music that I love.
Has anybody ever done that, or have you ever done that, drawn up a list to accompany the novels? Because not only have you got all the literary references of so many books in each novel, you've also got all the music. I mean, you've got a whole playlist for every single novel. And that, I imagine, is also, again, a way of anchoring each novel, each couple, Emma and Dexter, and so on, in a particular time period.
Yeah, if you go on my Spotify profile, you can find out Emma Morley's whole record collection.
Wow!
I mean, about 2,000 songs. And Dexter has a much smaller one, and the music isn't as good. But it was a way for me, you know, in the same way that when you create a character, you need to know what they're wearing. You also need to know what they're reading and what they're listening to and what they watch on television. It's just part of the business of building a character. So for me, it's partly about, when I'm writing, summing up a time and place, but also a mood. And music is a big influence on Sweet Sorrow in particular. There's one particular song by Pulp, by the British band Pulp, which was a big part of the inspiration for Sweet Sorrow, a song called David's Last Summer, which is a great song, but which provided just the right mood for the end of the novel. The idea, that realization when you realize that the evenings are getting shorter and the summer is going.
The fascinating aspect, again, of every single novel is that media, if you like, social media, play almost no role whatsoever, which, you know, at some point, some people may then accuse you of being nostalgic, you know, writing these books with, you know, these rom-coms or whatever. And I think that must be, in a way, a little bit like when a brilliant female novelist, say like Marion Keyes, is accused of writing chick lit, because it's never that. It's so much more than that. And I just wonder how you feel about this this epithet of, you know, of the nostalgic rom-com novel. I mean, I don't think that you do write that kind of novel, but yeah.
I try not to think too much about how I might be described or pigeonholed, because because my instinct is immediately to do something different, to do the opposite. But it's true, you know, I'm wary of the word nostalgia, because it seems to suggest a longing for the past. And often the books are about regret. They're about the past going wrong, about the present being so much better. So I don't like the idea that they're kind of wallowing in the past. But my fourth novel mainly takes place in the present day, in Europe, in real places. But it's written from the point of view of someone who, again, has no contact with social media or much contact with the internet. So it doesn't really play a role. And it's true, I think it's the great challenge in writing about the present day. How do you put the digital world on the page? Because the digital world is changing all the time and the page is fixed. As soon as you put in a reference to Facebook, is it going to look ridiculous in 2 years' time? Are we going to change the way we feel about that website? It's a very difficult business to put, you know, even a text in a novel now feels a bit dated. And so when you write about the digital world, you are immediately stamping a date on your book, and it may expire very quickly. And maybe that's fine. That's okay. Books don't have to last forever. But the internet is always going to be less interesting to read on the page than a real life encounter between two flesh and blood people. So I'm going to have to find a way of dealing with it. But I think it has its limitations for novelists. I would want to see people in the same room talking face to face, because it's so much more spontaneous and complicated and ambiguous than the way we communicate online.
The problem is now, of course, we've been several months in this particular lockdown, and I imagine that no new novel ever from now on in, looking at contemporary times, will not be able to mention the pandemic.
Yeah.
And we've been living online. You and I are not sitting together on a stage in Istanbul. We're talking to each other from our separate homes. And I mean, technology is going to feature much more. I mean, what about, can you imagine writing a Zoom love story?
Yeah.
We're going to have to tackle this in the arts, I think, too. And already people are writing plays and so on about this time.
I think there will be something interesting to say about it, but at the same time, it's so full of cliches, isn't it? You know, people talking about the Zoom call and it's very hard to be fresh about something when you're actually living it. And so this year, I thought maybe I would write a contemporary love story, a little novella. I was going to write a little kind of 100-page love story with just 2 characters. But what does present day mean? It doesn't mean anything at the moment. It's changing for everyone, and it's different around the world as well. So for the moment, I'm just stepping away, and I'm interested to watch and to see what happens. But I think the themes of that lockdown, that the virus bring out about isolation, loneliness, how we communicate, all of those things are interesting, but I don't want to hear about them now. It's too frightening and frustrating, I think, as a subject matter now.
It is an interesting time in many ways, and we cannot possibly analyse what's happening properly at the moment. We are, all of us, living in a bubble of a kind, and trying to keep out the outside world as far as possible. We want to live, and it is really difficult, isn't it, to think what is going to come out of this creatively. Not only are the creative industries, the arts, actually collapsing in all our theatres and so on. This is happening all over the world. It is a really shocking time for the arts, and here we are talking about art.
Yeah.
I mean,
yes, when people were locked in, the first thing they did was reach for their books and their television and their films and music. You know, that was a great comfort. At the same time, and I can only really speak about Britain, it's a disaster for so many of my friends who are actors, writers, directors, you know, to see their work evaporate without government support. And I hope we can find a way to support writers and artists. I can't speak for Turkey, but in Britain, you know, to keep those industries alive, so that this is very important, so that it doesn't become a rich person's industry. You know, I'm very lucky to have a certain amount of financial security because of One Day, but I worry about all the writers who won't be able to write because of the current situation, and all the brilliant actors who will go undiscovered, and all the great plays that have been cancelled. So it's a very troubling, sad time for a lot of artists. The only optimism I can find in it is that after the First World War and after the great flu epidemic of 1918, there was a great flourishing of the arts, a new generation, a whole new raft of ideas, and maybe we're seeing the beginning of that. But I'm probably not the person to lead that, because, you know, I'm a middle-aged 55-year-old man, but I think great things will come out of it. But I do worry that that it's been a catastrophe for British theatre, British film, television, and I hope we can find a way out soon.
On the one hand, you could say that this is a great time for literature, because we are reading more. I mean, funnily enough, I don't know many writers who are actually writing at the moment. No. I think writers, you are all finding it quite difficult to write at the moment.
Yeah, it's impossible. I mean, it's impossible for me because I can hear my children outside the door even now. You know, I was used to having 6 or 7 hours a day where I could just be by myself, and that has disappeared, and it won't come back until the autumn. So it's frustrating for me. I haven't been able to concentrate. There's an air of anxiety that I think is not helpful. But great things will come out of it, I'm sure. But it's a difficult time.
This is also a time where we can't travel. We can't pick up many of the stimuli that we would normally need for great art. You could argue, and also, you know, there is this problem. Say we're not in Istanbul at the moment, and I'm sure that you would, as you did with us, you went all around Europe, all these amazing cities that you visited in that novel, which is, in fact, reading your novels again over the last few days and reading them in this era now in lockdown is an extraordinarily different experience for me. And I read Us when they're on their grand tour of Europe, and I thought, oh, you know, I long to be on the tour of Europe. Everything is going to change in that way. We won't be traveling in the same way. Literature won't travel in the same way. I mean, I work with a lot of international writers, as you know, and translators. You know, are they going to be able to still come? And, you know, are you going to be able to sit with your Dutch colleagues and so on, except on Zoom? Who knows? You know, that kind of contact and communication.
Yeah, I feel in two minds, you know, because some people have pointed out that, you know, if you do an event like this, it's really enjoyable for me. I hope you can all hear me and I'm making sense and not talking too much. But you can you can talk to a great many people than you would if you were in a bookshop. At the same time, I love bookshops and I love meeting people face to face, and I love meeting my translators and my publishers. And of course, there are environmental concerns and there are reasons not to travel, urgent reasons not to travel at the moment. But I do hope it comes back. I didn't travel until quite late in life. I didn't leave England until I was 22. I didn't get on a plane till I was 22. I didn't really discover Europe until my 30s. And it was really eye-opening to me. It was a great experience and very inspiring. And I hope we haven't lost that stimulus, that we can find a middle way.
Well, let's hope. Now, David, for the moment, I'm going to say thank you and see whether Namin is there and whether we have any questions.
You just mentioned that you like to meet your translators, and the translator of your book is listening to you right now. So you have a chance to meet her. Arzu is also listening online.
I wanted to say, teşekkür, tell me, teşekkür ederim, is that right?
Çok güzel oldu.
Teşekkür ederim, right.
Teşekkür ederim to Arzu, my translator in Turkey, and to my Turkish publishers. I'm very grateful.
Evet, Epsilon yayınlarından çıktı kitabı.
Yes, the book was published in Epsilon Publishing House. Well, I wonder, you said this is your first literature organization via Zoom. Did you do that before? Did you have a Zoom experience before?
I've done 2 or 3 of these, yes. But the last time my screen didn't work, and so I was just in a room shouting at the walls by myself like a lunatic for an hour. I've no idea if anyone was listening, so it was very strange. This has been much more enjoyable.
Evet, bunda bir teknik sorun yaşamadık şu ana kadar.
Yes, we did not have a technical problem so far, so therefore I'm very happy. And we have lots of people also who joined us. We mentioned the technological development, we mentioned social media subjects and bringing them into the novels. This year's motto of our festival was Sunflower Literature. Sunflower is a very interesting word in the Turkish language. It also means turning towards the sun or turning towards the light. That means we are carrying literature towards the sun or towards the light. And it is also a motto which was very much preferred by our coordinator, Karin. How do you feel? Would you like to do that again? Would you like to talk to your readers in Turkey? Or does it stress you? Is it not good for you for a Zoom meeting? How do you feel?
It's great, but I have no idea. You know, quite often when I do a book event, I can hear people laugh, or I can see their faces, and I can hear the response, or I can see someone falling asleep in the front row, and so I know I need to be more interesting. And I miss all of that. I miss the ability to meet readers and talk more informally. But it's also an amazing thing. I mean, this 6 months ago, this would have seemed like a science fiction film. So
We've
it's
all
exciting
so
too.
much, haven't we? We've learnt how to use this technology. And I mean, it's interesting that you were talking, David, previously about social media, or we were talking about that. And in your novels, nobody uses social media or even mobile phones, really. But you actually are quite active on social media now. And you've used this in lockdown to very good effect too. I've been incredibly impressed by what you've been doing to help other authors. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about that, because it's really fantastic.
Yes, I just felt very sad for authors who worked on books for years and years and years and weren't having the opportunity to celebrate, to speak about their work, to do events like this, just to celebrate with friends. You know, the launch of a book is a great tradition, and it's almost a reward for all those years of sitting by yourself. It's one of the rare times that authors see other people. So I've just drawn up a weekly list of all the new books coming out, and I'm always very happy to, I can't read them all, but I'm always very happy to, you know, to help and promote new writers. I don't have a very big Twitter following. You know, I'm very nervous on Twitter. I say very boring things. I just say thank you and here's a good book. That's all I say.
You're very witty. You always promise somebody crisps or nuts or something to the book launch, you know. I
Try
like
to recreate the experience of the book launch, yes. But I would love to be on it less. To be honest, it's been a bit of a distraction from reading and from writing. But it's also, even though it makes me very stressed, it's very addictive as well. I think it's a good thing. It's mainly the way I meet other readers at the moment, and writers as well. And that's great. But it also, I lose a lot of sleep about it as well.
David çok fazla okuduğunu ve
David, you read a lot. I know you like to read a lot. You said it feeds you. Did you
Yeah.
ever read any Turkish authors? We like to ask this question. If we meet
Yeah.
some author in Turkey, we ask them if they have read any Turkish authors' novels.
Do they always say Orhan Pamuk? I've read some. I've read some Pamuk.
evet. Şimdi birkaç daha
Usually they say Orhan Pamuk, but nowadays we have also other names.
Well, I know
Teşekkür ederim.
I know Elif Shafak and I know Orhan Pamuk, and I've read Orhan's Pamuk's Istanbul. When I came to Istanbul, I read his book of Istanbul, which I found fantastic. And I think The Museum of Innocence is the English title I've read. But I'm afraid that's all I know. So no, not very much.
İstanbul kitabını Orhan Pamuk'un
Istanbul by Orhan Pamuk. And one of the authors mentioned is Ahmet Hamdi Tanpınar. And the T in ITEF is Tanpınar, one of the famous Turkish authors. And we are very happy that you also could mention his name. Tanpınar is also our light. He's showing us the way. Thank you very much, both of you, for sparing your time for us. Is this your office or your living room, David?
It's not my usual office. It's usually I have to leave the house because of my children. But during the virus, I'm spending a lot of time here. So this is my home office. This is my bicycle, and that's
Evet.
my favorite place.
Rosie, senin odanı biliyoruz. Bu kırmızı koltuğunu biliyoruz.
So we know your red chair, Rosie. We read the story. So thank you very much for hosting us there. And thank you a lot. There are other people I would like to mention also them today. This year it was the 12th ITEF festival, and we have volunteers who have worked all these years. I would like them all. Great thanks to all of them for supporting us. And now I would like to have, with your permission, my team on the screen. I would like to thank them.
Of course.
They did a great job during the last week. And as I found out today, we have reached more than 10,000 people. This was the first digital Literature Festival online. Our translators, Dilara, Mine, I would like to thank you too. We were very excited, very anxious if you could do that, but we managed. In autumn, mid of September, we want to hold ITEF 2020 on the streets. Maybe you can also come, David. There are lots of people who would like to meet you with Epsilon Publishings. It would be great to host you, to have you here. So I take that as a promise. You're nodding.
I am. I would love to come. Thank you.
Şahane. Evet. Ve İstanbul sokaklarında birlikte
And we
yürürüz.
will be together walking on the streets of Istanbul. So my team, would you like to be on the screen too?
Oh, wonderful. Oh, it's great. Oh.
And our Regie is Mehmet Demirtaş. We'll all send you our love. Thank you all very, very much.
Thank you.
Best
Well.
regards to everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, so much. It's been a pleasure. David,
teşekkürler.
you know, again, such a pleasure to talk to you, and Namin and everyone.
Thank you, Norman. Thank you, everyone. It's been a real pleasure. I'm very, very pleased to be
O
here.
zaman İstanbul'da buluşmak üzere. Hoşça kalın.
Then meet you in Istanbul. Bye bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye. Bye.
Bye-bye.